For nearly 800 years, Rome represented far more than just a powerful city. It was the living symbol of order, civilization, and eternity. From its hills, empires were born, its streets saw glorious emperors parade, and its marble temples defied time with the arrogance of those who believe history belongs to them forever. For many, Rome could not fall. It was unthinkable. Unimaginable. Because if Rome fell, the known world would fall with it. Yet, in the year 410 AD, that illusion was shattered in brutal fashion. The Eternal City was sacked by the Goths, a barbarian people who had once been allies, subordinate, even useful, but never respected. What happened in those days was not merely an invasion. It was a spiritual blow, a symbolic wound that bled the empire from within. The walls, which for centuries had stood as a guarantee of protection, were breached. The aristocratic houses, once dictating the politics of the world, were plundered and stained with blood. And in the temples, where sacrifices had once been offered to Mars, Jupiter, or Christ, cries of despair now echoed. Rome, the city believed to be untouchable, had suddenly become just another victim of history. Its image of invulnerability, forged over centuries of conquest, was reduced to ashes and plunder. The world would never be the same again. Because that day, the Rome of the Caesars, of the senators, of the gods, ceased to be eternal. By the early 5th century, the Roman Empire was no longer a firm and majestic unity, but a wounded creature struggling to stand. The division between East and West, originally meant to ease administration, had become a fracture that weakened its political body. Constantinople, bright and secure, stood as the new center of power. Meanwhile, Rome, the ancient capital of the Caesars, languished under the weight of its past and the indifference of its present. Though no longer the imperial seat, Rome remained the symbolic heart of the empire, a city filled with history, pride, and ruins that still inspired respect. But the reality was different. Its streets were filled with foreigners, its statues covered in dust, and its once impregnable walls now bore invisible cracks. The glory of the days of the Circus Maximus and the Colosseum had faded, like the distant echo of an empire that had ruled the world but could no longer defend itself. The Visigoths, originating from the lands east of the Danube, had been accepted as allies under a fragile pact with Rome. In theory, they had been offered land, autonomy, and respect. In practice, they were used as cannon fodder, despised for their barbarian origin, and treated as disposable tools. Their leader, Alaric, a veteran of military campaigns, knew Rome's weaknesses inside out. He had fought for the empire, but he knew there was no real place for his people within its arrogant and decaying structure. Resentment grew. The arrogance of the emperors, especially that of the young and inept Honorius, only fueled the discontent. Rome still stood, but its foundations were rotten. It was no longer a question of if it would fall, but when, and who would dare to bring it down. Alaric was no ordinary barbarian. He had grown up in the shadow of the empire, trained in its ways, schooled in its military tactics, educated in its language and religion. He had faithfully served as commander of Visigothic troops in Rome's service, and he knew from within its strengths, but above all, its weaknesses. For years, he had fought in campaigns ordered by emperors who would never see him as their equal. He was a general without a homeland, useful but invisible. And that consumed him. Alaric's disillusionment was not only political, it was personal. At the Battle of the Frigidus River, his men had been used as sacrificial fodder. Thousands died, thrown to the front lines without recognition. While Rome celebrated its victory, he and his soldiers buried their dead without glory, without gratitude. They had bled for an empire that looked down on them. It was then that Alaric realized an irreversible truth: Rome would never accept them as part of the whole. No matter how hard they fought, how brave they were, they would always be the barbarians, the outsiders, the expendable. With that certainty lodged in his heart like a spear, Alaric made a decision. If Rome would not give them a place by reason, they would take it by force. Not as savages, but as a wounded nation demanding justice. He began consolidating his leadership, winning the absolute loyalty of his troops, uniting tribes, organizing armies, and crafting a strategy no emperor would see coming. He no longer sought revenge, he sought dignity. Rome, blinded by imperial arrogance, did not understand in time. The young Honorius, surrounded by flatterers and incompetents, ignored his demands, used him in other wars, and never kept his promises. For Alaric, it was the final insult. The ancient world was changing, and he would be the spark to set it ablaze. Rome did not fall instantly. What happened was even more cruel. It was worn down, strangled slowly, as if an invisible monster gripped its throat tighter each day. Alaric, a master of psychological warfare, did not need to raise his sword immediately. It was enough to surround the city, close the roads, and block the port of Ostia. Rome, which for centuries had controlled the seas and the roads, suddenly found itself isolated, unable to feed its people, powerless against hunger. The streets, once bustling, turned into corridors of silence and wailing. Markets closed. Grain reserves were exhausted. The nobility began selling their jewels for bread, and the plebeians, for a piece of meat, were willing to kill. There was cannibalism. There was despair. The pride of Rome crumbled, not under fire, but under the invisible weight of time, of fear, of an empty stomach. Honorius, sheltered in his palace at Ravenna, seemed to live in another world. Instead of negotiating, instead of paying what he had promised, he let his people die slowly. Alaric waited. He observed. And finally, he accepted a massive payment to withdraw. He took gold, silk, jewels, and more than 40,000 freed Visigothic slaves. Rome believed it had bought time. But it had only purchased its humiliation. It wasn't long before the Visigothic leader returned. This time, he would ask for nothing. This time, he would take what Rome had denied him for decades. Not just wealth, respect. And for the first time in almost 800 years, the Eternal City would open its gates to an invader. On the night of August 24, 410 AD, Rome did not fall with a crash, but with the creak of a door opening from within. Some say it was slaves who unbolted the gates. Others speak of treachery or desperation. But the truth is that on that night, the enemy crossed the walls that for centuries had been thought invincible. 30,000 Visigoths advanced through the arteries of Rome like a silent shadow. Torches lit up statues of forgotten emperors, broken columns, and pagan temples. In a matter of hours, mansions were looted, treasures torn from palaces, mausoleums desecrated. The ashes of emperors who had once ruled the world were scattered to the wind, as if time itself had rejected them. But not all was fire and blood. Alaric, even in conquest, set limits. He forbade the looting of Christian temples. He ordered that the basilicas of St. Peter and St. Paul serve as refuge for civilians. Many found safety under their domes, but many others, especially the nobles and the powerful, found no escape. Neither the toga nor noble birth protected anyone that night. For 3 days, the city that had given laws to the world became a hell of screams, weeping, and flames. The jewels of the temples, golden candelabras, sacred relics, all were seized. And although the sack was not as brutal as others would be in history, the blow was symbolic. Rome had been touched. Wounded. Humiliated. Not by a great rival empire. Not by a foreign superpower. But by those who had once begged for a place within its borders. The Visigoths did not destroy Rome. They did something worse, they dragged her down from her pedestal. The city that had taken the world was now plundered without mercy. After the clamor came silence. A dense, heavy silence that floated over the rubble, the desecrated temples, and the corpses still uncollected. Rome, the Eternal City, awoke defeated. The sack had not only stripped it of riches, it had torn out the soul of an empire that for centuries believed it could never fall. Hundreds of thousands fled. The exodus was brutal. It is estimated that nearly 300,000 Romans abandoned the city, seeking refuge in Egypt, Asia Minor, anywhere stability still breathed. Many were welcomed. Others were sold into slavery by local governors who already saw the collapse of imperial order as an opportunity to enrich themselves. Those who remained faced not only material ruin, but also a spiritual civil war. Tensions between Christians and pagans deepened. Each side blamed the other for the disaster. For Christians, the sack was divine punishment for abandoning the true faith. For pagans, it was the wrath of the forgotten gods of old. Rome bled both outwardly and inwardly. Meanwhile, in Ravenna, Honorius remained in his world of disconnection and indifference. History tells that, upon hearing the news that Rome had fallen, his first thought was for his favorite rooster, also named Rome. Only when it was clarified that it was the city did he show a shallow shock. His indifference was more than a symbol, it was a sentence. Rome's already faltering political power crumbled. The senatorial elite fractured, institutions lost credibility, and ordinary people stopped believing in the empire's protection. Deep down, something had changed. For the first time, Rome ceased to be the center of the world and became a symbol of decay, vulnerability, and nostalgia. The sack of 410 was not the immediate end of the Western Roman Empire. But it was the beginning of the end, a clear sign that times had changed, that the peoples who once feared Rome could now subdue her, and that the barbarians, once rejected, were now the new players on the European stage. Alaric did not live long after the sack. He died shortly after, during a campaign in southern Italy. According to legend, he was buried in the bed of the Busento River along with his treasure, while slaves diverted the river's course, only to be executed to keep the location a secret. Such was the mystery of his end. But his legacy was not the gold he took, it was the wound he left. With the entry of his Visigoths into Rome, Alaric had achieved the unthinkable, he shattered the myth of the eternal city. The walls, the statues, the ancient glories, none of it was enough. In 3 days, all of it was reduced to ashes, fear, and disillusionment. Rome was no longer invincible. And the world knew it. From then on, sacks would not be a rarity, but a constant. 45 years later, the Vandals would repeat the story. But the first time is always the one that marks history. And Alaric, with his crusade of rage, ambition, and justice, forever changed the course of European history. His impact was spiritual, psychological, geopolitical. The sack set off waves of migration, fragmented the empire's social fabric, and unleashed a new order, that of the barbarian kingdoms. The Visigoths, shortly afterward, settled in Gaul and founded their own kingdom. The granting of lands by Emperor Honorius was not just a concession, it was a historic capitulation. Many historians agree that the sack of 410 marked the true beginning of the Middle Ages. The symbol of Western civilization, the city that had illuminated the world with its law, art, architecture, and power, was now crawling among ruins and internal discord. Saint Jerome summed it up with a lament that echoed through the centuries. The city that took the world, has been taken. The sack of Rome by the Goths was not merely the fall of a city. It was the end of an era. For centuries, Rome had been the heart beating in the chest of the ancient world. Everything that meant order, law, power, art, civilization, seemed to have its origin and destiny in her. But on August 24, 410 AD, all of that shook. Alaric and his Visigoths did not just take jewels, gold, or statues. They took something that would never be recovered, the faith in Rome's invulnerability. The echoes of that day resound even now. Because the true blow was not physical, but symbolic. The myth was broken. The empire, once master of the world, discovered that even the eternal has its twilight. And so began the slow dawn of a new world. One more fragmented, darker, more uncertain. But also one that, centuries later, would look again to the ruins of Rome for the lessons of her greatness, and of her fall. For if history teaches us anything, it is this. Every empire, no matter how powerful it seems, is always one step away from collapse, if it forgets where it comes from and for whom it governs.